Hey everyone, welcome back to our study of Acts. We are finishing up Paul's speech in front of Agrippa, and then finally his voyage and journey to Rome starts with our passage for today. Let me open with our prayer, then I also have an announcement before we get into our lesson for today. But let's open with prayer, and then I'll offer this to you. Let the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. My announcement is I had told you I'm going to start giving you these reminders as we go through these videos, knowing that some of you are catching up on these videos, as I know it's a lot to keep with unless you have that set time every day to watch these videos, which I'm very appreciative of, not just because I'm happy for me that you're watching them, but because this is, to me, Bible study is an integral part of any part of the life of a church. Normally, we would be doing this more interactively. Right now, this is the way we have to do it. But this is my announcement, is that interactively, I had mentioned maybe about a week ago, I wanted to end with a Zoom session on our last day. I had originally suggested Monday, the 19th. I would like to submit a new date for us to do that, and that would be Sunday evening, the 18th. At 5 o'clock, just to have a time to gather for me to kind of hit some high points from Acts, but also to give you a chance to have some input, particularly on the question, what is it that the study of Acts has to speak concerning our functioning as the church today, more importantly, our identity as the church today. And that goes back to the question I posed right at the beginning of this series, where a lot of people like to imitate the Church of Acts, whereas it's not about imitating, I hope you've seen, because there's a whole lot of things that are exclusive to the time frame of 2,000 years ago. But particularly what we heard in the speech from yesterday, and more of what we're going to hear from Paul today, there are some themes which are core central elements of how the church lives and believes and proclaims the Word of God here today. Those are the things I want to pull out and have a chance to have some back and forth conversation with. So, Sunday, the 18th at 5 o'clock is when I would like to have that Zoom meeting. I will remind you as we go forward with each of these, because this Saturday will be our very last one of these videos, as we will finally be finished with Acts. Finally, in the sense, yeah, it's been a long haul, it's been a lot of work putting these videos together, but it also has been a great joy for me to be able to do that, and a special thanks to Elizabeth Pack and Adam Valentoy, who have been the ones who have been doing the editing and doing the final draft copies of these videos, so that you can see beyond the raw, unedited version that I send to them to make it look pretty and neat each day that we gather. So, all of that being said, let's get into today's reading. We begin on chapter 26, verse 24, and we'll go through chapter 27, verse 8. While Paul was making this defense, Festus exclaimed, "You are out of your mind, Paul. Too much learning is driving you insane." But Paul said, "I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I am speaking the sober truth. Indeed, the king knows about these things, and to him I speak freely, for I am certain that none of these things has escaped his notice, for this was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe." Agrippa said to Paul, "Are you so quickly persuading me to become a Christian?" Paul replied, "Whether quickly or not, I pray to God that not only you, but also all who were listening to me today might become such as I am, except for these chains." The king got up, and with him the governor and Bernice, and those who had been seated with them. And as they were leaving, they said to one another, "This man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment." Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to the emperor." When it was decided that we were to sail for Italy, they transferred Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. Embarking on a ship of Adramyttium that was about to set sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon. And Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends to be cared for. Putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. After we had sailed across the sea that is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship bound for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, and as the wind was against us, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone. Sailing past it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lacia. All right, so got two parts today, the voyage, which we'll get into, spend a little time on that at the end, but finishing the speech because while the bulk of the content of the speech that Paul gives in front of Agrippa and Festus and that very select private audience was from our text yesterday, there's some very important things to consider from today's text, not least to mention is the continuation of what I brought up at the end of yesterday in Paul's proclamation that he is a light to the Gentiles and of this resurrected Messiah. Because the exchange that Festus and then Agrippa have with Paul in today's setting have to do with those same stumbling blocks, for lack of a better term, although a very accurate term, to describe how both the Jews and now the Gentiles are tripping up over these things and causing Paul either alienation or people, in this case, who are ridiculing him or looking at him down their noses, so to speak. So when we come in today to today's lesson, Paul had mentioned at the end of yesterday, I want to stress this again, that he talked about the Messiah must suffer and that being the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light both to our people and to the Gentiles. And he is saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses had said would take place. So he's calling on their authority again here to, again, not say this is the fulfillment of the law, but rather he is called, like Jesus, in a role like Moses, to bring this good news to the people. And as such, the tradition is being handed down through these people who were pillars of the tradition and law of Israel. Festus, of course, has no familiarity with this whatsoever, except just from political expediency needs and knowledge. Agrippa and Bernice, however, being secular Jews, at least have the knowledge at their disposal. So, as Paul is saying these things, we pick up today in verse 24. He has said, the Messiah must suffer, rise from the dead, and by doing that would proclaim light to the Jews and the Gentiles. So that very theme of resurrection immediately is what Festus today says this as Paul was making his defense. Remind you, this is not a legal defense, but rather a theological apology. That's really the tone of what it means by defense if you take the entire tenor of Acts and Luke's narrative into context. Festus exclaims, "You are out of your mind, Paul. Too much learning is driving you insane." So we saw before that when Felix was the one who was the governor, that he recognized, just as Claudius Lysias, the tribune, recognized that Paul has intelligence. That this is not dismissing Paul because he's dumb or, to use the word, insane, but rather he emphasizes too much learning is driving you insane. There was this belief in the ancient world that philosophers could have too much learning, we would say here in East Tennessee, had too much schooling. And they could be so cerebral that they would be totally out of touch with the practical needs of the world today. And herein we've gone now from the Jewish problem with Paul's theology and, of course, the understanding of Jesus that no, the Messiah cannot be resurrected in the past. It's a future event. And we crucified this man. Paul's talking about this man as if he's the Son of God. That's blasphemy. That's obviously more to it than that, but that's the nutshell of the Jewish problem of Jesus. The Gentile problem now is where we switch today, and that is that this is all foolishness, superstition, as Festus called before. But I want to emphasize to you the fact that when he talks about Paul being insane, he does talk about Paul's great learning. And he talks about this as from a Gentile perspective. This is what Robert Wall emphasizes, and I think he's very right on this, that the assessment of a Gentile like Festus on one's sanity is a measure, as he uses the word, quote, of the human mind and its ability to discern what is practical. In other words, assessing what is. That's the idea of justice for Gentiles is fairness, of saying that everybody's treated equal, of everybody has a fair sense of what actually is in the world. The other part of it with Gentiles, though, in particularly for Festus, but Agrippa is very much in this camp too as a secular Jew, is that we saw a little bit of this when Paul was up at the Areopagus in Athens talking with the Athenians. The Athenians were all about talking about different ideas, but there was not a commitment to any particular idea unless it had a direct benefit to them. But rather it was, well, we're going to sit here and weigh the ideas. We're going to live our lives the way we want. This is a self-indulgent lifestyle, but we like talking about these different ideas. But the Roman world was one in which you had this tolerance, at least to the point, of these different beliefs, of these different cultures, as long as it did not interfere with the aims and the trajectory and the vision of Rome itself. There was tolerance of these things, and that was a value of the Roman Gentile world, was tolerance for these different viewpoints. And that was often where, when Jews were persecuted by the Romans, it was because they perceived them as being these very particularist and very intolerant people who were only concerned with their own affairs and at best were indifferent to the affairs of Rome. At worst, they were in opposition to the affairs of Rome. So all of this is obviously not about conflict, but rather the values of Rome in conflict with the proclaiming of the gospel. A gospel, which, mind you, is one that is very particular, is very based on specific events. And while very much ironically, it has a universal feel to it to all Jews and Gentiles, but yet it is not, you just sort of, it's like the amalgamation or syncretism. You pick here, kind of like a menu. Pick one from column A, pick one from column B, mash them together, and that's what you have. The gospel, and of course Judaism as well, very opposed to this idea and theory that you can just mash together these different traditions and still have a message consistent with the traditions of Israel and now the proclamation of Jesus. So when Paul is saying this, Festus is reacting to him because this idea of the resurrection is insane. But this idea that there's a very specific purpose and intent in this mission is also something that is totally, in a way, offensive, or at very least very troubling to Festus and the Gentiles who were there. But it's interesting to note when he talks about Paul is out of his mind and yet conflicts it with his great learning, Paul's response to him, I am not out of my mind, but I am speaking the sober truth. So the word that is used in that word sober is a word that literally means in Greek, it's sophrosine, which means intellectual sobriety. So in other words, Paul is asserting not just that he's not crazy, but that his message is, to use a measure of Gentile standards, is a measure of intellectual neatness and tidiness. Very, very important for today's world, especially in our world today, which seems to question experts or question people who have training on certain things. And the church, of course, especially in America, with movements of and this is not a condemnation. I will be very clear when I say this, but American religion is full of, the Spirit calls you to do something, you do it. And I believe firmly that there are plenty of very legitimate, sincere, Spirit-filled people who do not have the quote education. They don't go to seminary or they do anything like that, who proclaim the message of God. That's another thing to say that those who have that are not worthy because, intellectualism is the enemy of the gospel in the minds of some people. And today it seems that intellectualism is the enemy of society in the eyes of some people. And this could not be further from the truth in the book of Acts. In fact, in all of Scripture, this desire that it is a gospel proclaiming of one's experience of God, but also of understanding. The gospel enlightens one's understanding. As Paul himself says in his letters, not through the wisdom of the world, but through a wisdom that is given by the Spirit to those who believe. So it requires a commitment of belief in addition to a commitment of the mind. And that is where the Gentile falls short in the eyes of Luke and of Paul in this narrative. The Gentile is always willing to commit his mind or her mind to something, but it's a matter of commitment of the heart is what matters. So the first accusation made is that Paul's crazy. And Paul says, I'm speaking the sober truth, or I'm speaking with intellectual sobriety, is what Paul says, which is a great retort to the words of Festus in that regard. And then he turns and faces the king. And this is where Agrippa's response comes in, because now he's looking at Agrippa, who is the ranking member of this small private body that's gathered, and says, "You know these things. Do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe." Well, none of us like being put on the spot, but in a way, Christianity is about making a personal commitment and choice. And in Roman culture and society, you sort of detach yourselves from any sort of commitment, not just because that's the cool thing to do, so to speak, but because it's expedient politically not to be attached to one party or the other. While the political figures in these stories have been catering to the temple leadership because it's politically expedient, they're not favoring them at all because of their ideas. And that was a standard Roman attitude toward anything. Well, Paul, in essence, puts Agrippa on the spot in front of all of his subjects and Bernice and says, I know you believe in this. Tell me what you think about this, because you know these things. And Agrippa's words back to him, are you so quickly persuading me to become a Christian? Said in somewhat of a mocking tone by Agrippa, not because he's mocking Paul, but rather mocking that Paul would ask him to do something like this. The word, when it says become a Christian, is a Greek word called poleo, which is a word which literally means to make or perform. And it is rather, in some commentators, and some take this more serious than others, but most of the commentators that I read see this as more of a sarcastic, witty exchange than one that's actually serious. But rather, what is serious in this is that Agrippa is telling Paul, you're trying to make me a Christian. And rather, the irony here, and this again is from Robert Wall, and I think this is very insightful into the behind the text here. He says it is about, perhaps all Agrippa is asking is whether he could, quote unquote, perform the role of a Christian, presumably to demonstrate both his good sense and his identity with his Jewish subjects. But to perform a role is not to become a true believer. And I think that's at the heart of this text. Is Agrippa says, yeah, I'll be what I can be to politically expedient, which another irony is Paul's the one who says, I will be all things to all people in order to win them to Christ. Whereas Agrippa says, I will be all things to all people so that it will benefit me and will make my rule much smoother. That's the essential, that's the implication of what he's saying. Both are saying in their own way, I will be all things to all people, but for Paul, it is for the specific purpose of winning someone to a knowledge and to a relationship with Christ, and not to one's own self-interest like Agrippa. So I hope you can see those important themes which are so prevalent in our world, this push against intellectualism, that Christianity and push against intellectuals of our day too, who look at Christians as being these non-thinking, non-rational people, and understanding the role of intellectualism within Christianity, not as an end to itself, mind you, but rather that the gospel wants us to have a mind and a heart that are able to articulate the message of Christ, but also to this sense of we are a world which also today sports teams we make commitments to, things that are a little more trivial, but we are a society that has become more lax on commitments that we make to things in general. And not to point fingers at any particular group, because it's all of us who are that way. And that's another sort of prophetic finger being pointed at us from this story as well. Something I will talk about in our Zoom meeting when we do that over next weekend. So then, very quickly, because we're coming up on time again, the king gets up, and with him the governor and Bernice and those who had been seated with them. And again, they repeat the political charge, which we knew already coming into this. There's nothing that this man has done to deserve death or imprisonment. And Agrippa says to Festus, if this man hadn't appealed, he would be set free. But he is, by Agrippa's perspective, trapped in his appeal. He has to follow through on that. You can't waste the Caesar's time when you've appealed to Caesar. But from Luke's perspective, this is part of God's plan playing out. Paul is not trapped politically, but rather he is continuing on this journey of fulfilling his destiny to go to Rome. And so then finally, just very quickly, as we get into chapter 27, the journey to Rome starts. And I want to ask Elizabeth, throw up the map here. Now we're going to need maps for this next chapter coming up. And just real quick, because really this is more geography here, but I just want you to see. So again, they're sailing from Caesarea. There's a centurion named Julius, who Paul and Julius will have some interactions in the next couple of passages we'll look at. They embark on a ship called of Atramidium, which is a city on the western coast of modern-day Turkey. And the point of that, it's a ship that's meant to sail basically that eastern Mediterranean route, but is not equipped to go into the open waters of the central Mediterranean. So it's a short-range vessel that they embark on there in Caesarea. They put to sea. Paul's accompanied by Aristarchus, who was one of his companions from Macedonia. We've seen him before. So even on this trip, with Paul being a prisoner, he has companions. Then the next day they put in at Sidon up the coast. And then here you already see Julius treating Paul kindly, as most of the Romans are disposed to look favorably upon him, allows Paul not only to have his companions, but to go see some of his companions and friends who were in Sidon. Then they put out to sea. They sail under the lee of Cyprus, and you can see what that means. They basically sail on the narrow straits of the side of Cyprus because the wind was against them. So they're trying to protect themselves from the wind. Follow along on the map. They sail across the sea that's off Cilicia and Pamphylia, where Tarsus is. They come to Myra and Lycia, and there they hop on board a long-range ship, an Alexandrian ship bound for Italy. And you notice that it then says we sail with difficulty, which is the theme of this journey, that the voyage is a very difficult one. This is not an easy voyage for Paul to make, despite the fact that it's the will of God that Paul heads to Rome. It doesn't mean it's still not without challenge, which fits the narrative that Paul has faced challenge and persecution all throughout this journey to this point. It's fitting that the journey to Rome would also be filled with that. So then they proceed under the lee of Crete, again, the narrow side of Crete, off Salmone. They sail past it, and then they land at a place on the south of Crete called the Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. So we'll have this map back up tomorrow, come back to me. So tomorrow's reading for you, by the way, is chapter 27, verses 9 through 26. So we will have that for you tomorrow, and that will continue the voyage. So this map will be back up for you tomorrow as we go through that. But I hope from today you see, as Paul is now with difficulty making his journey to Rome, that you will also see that his proclamation of the gospel is going to find new ways to continue even on this difficult journey of sailing from the eastern side of the Mediterranean over to the western side of the Mediterranean, and that Paul's faithfulness in God and the fact that God's mission is being carried out for him in spite of these difficulties continues to give him confidence and joy in proclaiming the faith. So, again, good passage today. Thank you as always for listening. And again, please note on your calendar Sunday, the 18th, 5 o'clock, for our concluding Zoom meeting for this, which, by the way, I will record in case you can't be there. I'll record it so you can hear some of the conversation, and it'll be posted up on YouTube. Thank you, my friends, for joining me. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Take care.